Tomas, thank you so much for joining us here in Rappler.
Thank you for having me, of course.
You wrote this Medium post about why we should be acting, looking at the data all around the world, and it has gotten tens of millions of views around the world. Why did you do this, and what did you find?
Yeah, so why is really it just happened. I started seeing it around a month ago. The news, like everybody else, and I looked into it, and what I saw was exponential growth, and my job is in exponential growth. It's in creating it, identifying it, and pushing it. So as soon as I saw it, I understood what the potential was, and so I started posting on Facebook a couple of articles about it, and I realized two things. The first thing is people wanted to know more about it. They didn't know much, and two, most people were not realizing how bad the problem was. And so it's interesting. I could see it coming weeks in advance, and I was seeing people not reacting to it. So every day I would post more and more and more and more, and more people would come, start following me, start following the advice, saying that they wanted to hear more. And at some point, 2 weeks in, somebody said, "Hey, what you're writing makes a lot of sense. I need a package to send this to a group of friends so that they react." So I put basically everything I had on Facebook, all the analysis properly structured, and put it on Medium, and that's it. I expected maybe 10,000 views, 50,000 views. My most viral post before that had around 250,000 views. So at most something like this, but I was definitely not prepared for tens of millions of views.
And from the countries that you looked at, looking at this exponential growth, I think the hardest thing is for normal people, for all of us to understand exactly what exponential growth means. How did you explain it? What is the?
Yeah, so I think the one of the best ways to look at it is with the graphs and with comparisons. People had a good understanding of what had happened with China. So every time you compared the reality with what happened in China, people really paid attention. One of the examples is Wuhan ordered a lockdown when they had around 500 official cases. And even last week when I wrote this, there was a bunch of countries that were past that level and they were not doing anything. So when that really caught people's attention because they realized, oh wow, Wuhan had tens of thousands of people, thousands of dead because of this, and we are past that level and we haven't done anything. That was, I think, one of the big ones. The other one is as I mentioned, the graphs, because everybody knew that Italy was going like this and Iran was going like this, and everybody thought, it's just these countries, they've mismanaged it, we're fine. But then if you zoomed into the small little countries that were not very big yet, you could see that it was an exponential for everybody. And from there, it's relatively easy to know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. If you have 100 cases and you're growing exponentially, if you don't do anything, at some point, you're going to be worse than China.
And then post that, I thought what was interesting about what you did is not only did you show the exponential growth and that it could become worse than China, you also tackled things like even as China, here are the reported numbers, but what wasn't reported is actually far more significant. You showed it in China's case, in Wuhan's case. I guess, can you explain that as well?
That's right. There's two ways in which the official cases don't correspond to the true cases. The first one is testing. Right? You have countries like South Korea that are testing everybody and they're uncovering a lot of cases, but most of the other countries aren't. Right? And so how are you supposed to know the number of true cases when you when you only have the official ones? And so I used a couple of ways to approximate that. One of them was with the number of deaths, because you can tell how many deaths there are because of the coronavirus, because usually if you think the death might have been caused by it, you're going to test it, right? So you know the deaths, and there's an approximate ratio between the deaths and the cases, right? And the way it works is if you died today, you were probably infected 3 weeks ago. But let's say that the fatality rate is just 1%, right? So 3 weeks ago, there were 100 people infected, and only one of them died 3 weeks later, right? So these 100 cases that existed 3 weeks ago, these cases are doubling approximately on average every week. So it doubled 3 times, times 2,
Wow.
times 2, times 2, that's multiplied by 8. So these 100 cases 3 weeks ago mean 800 cases today. So one death, as a rule of thumb, means 800 cases, right? So and that was not in the official numbers. So that's one of the ways. The other way, the one that you were referring to, is the fact that by the time you come to the doctor, you already have symptoms, you're already sick, and so the case is a diagnostic. That's not when you became infected. And so the graph that was beautiful about Wuhan is this difference between the official cases and the true cases. These true cases, the way they assessed them was looking backwards. Every time they had somebody come in and was diagnosed, they asked, when did you start having the symptoms? And so thanks to that, you can get 2 curves. You get the curve for the true cases and the one for the official cases. And you can see that the official cases are 2 weeks later than the true cases. So that's a good way. Then if you make the comparison with people in other countries, you're saying, look, if you have 500 cases right now, you have substantially more. You're just not seeing it because people just got infected and they don't even have the symptoms yet.
You also talk about essentially what government should be managing for, right? That in the end, it goes down to the healthcare facilities. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah.
What?
That's right. Yeah. So a lot has been said about the fatality rate of the coronavirus, and that's defined as if you catch it, will you die, basically. And the range is very big. It goes from around 0.5% to 5%. So that's a 10 times difference, right?
Wow.
0.5 is still bad. It is around 4 times worse than the flu, which already kills tens of thousands of people, 100,000, millions of people, maybe every year in the world. And so it is bad, but 0.5% is much better than 5%. So what is causing this difference between the two? And what we're seeing is we can tell the difference based on different regions. For example, in China, the region of Hubei was completely overwhelmed. The healthcare system was completely overwhelmed. They couldn't handle everybody. Specifically, the part that they could not handle properly was the people who needed intense care. They need ventilators because their lungs don't work anymore. And without those ventilators or other machines that put oxygen straight into the blood, these people die. And when your healthcare system is overwhelmed, you don't have enough of these, and people die. You compare so the fatality rate in Hubei is 5%, it's close to 5%. Outside of Hubei is around 0.9%, right? Why? Because in these other areas, the systems were not overwhelmed. And then the same thing happened with South Korea on one side and Italy on the other side. Nearly identical situation. You have a fatality rate in South Korea of around 0.6%, and in Italy is close to 4 or 5%. Same thing. They didn't get overwhelmed in South Korea, and they did get overwhelmed in Italy. And so, to the point here is the number one goal of this is not actually that nobody has it, because that's hard. We should try, but that's not the number one goal. The number one goal is not to overwhelm the healthcare system.
That makes sense. And then, one of the things that I had done early on, I had covered SARS in 2002 to 2003 out of Singapore, right? And then post-SARS, looked at how they codified the lessons they learned in their system. And this is part of what they're doing, right? What they said today is that there's a tripod that every government is going to have to deal with. The tripod, it's the quality of the healthcare system of each country, quality of governance. And then the last part is social cohesion, is that part. And Singapore is, you also wrote this in your piece. You said that three countries to look at are the ones Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, I believe, right?
Yes.
And all of these three have dealt with the SARS virus, and they moved relatively proactively on it. Singapore still does not have a death, despite the fact that,
that's right. They have more
yes.
than 200 cases, not a single death.
And I think that aligns with exactly what you said, because the managers of Singapore have actually stated that they're managing for ventilators, for the healthcare capacity, for intensive care capacity for them.
Okay.
If you were a government today, or you're a leader, what advice would you give?
Buy yourself time. Right now, most countries in the world are just overwhelmed, not just on the healthcare system, but at the political system. Because unlike Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, that went through this, they haven't, and they don't understand what exponential growth is, and they don't understand all the consequences that are going to happen. And so you have this combination of a world full of unknowns and a threat that's coming at you at an accelerated speed. The most valuable thing that you can do right now is give yourself time. You stop this thing. It gives you enough time to react to it. So what does it mean? It means that I believe right now countries should that have a fair amount of cases should be as aggressive as the economy and society can tolerate. Why? Because of many reasons. Number one is, of course, the number of cases and transmissions goes down, right? So that's the first thing. The healthcare system gets a relief. It gives you time to do proper testing, so you understand the magnitude of the problem. It gives you time to build capacity in the system. More ICU beds, more ventilators, more masks, all these things. It gives you time to increase the production of all these things. It gives you time to understand the different measures that you can take and what is the cost and benefit of each one of them, how much each measure reduces the transmission rate, and how much it costs socially. Because right now they have thousands of potential measures and they don't know which ones to pick. And it's very hard because these different measures have different costs. And so for these, there's many more reasons why if you act immediately, right now, and hard, it slows down everything. It gives you time to think. It gives you a few weeks in which then you can have a more intelligent approach for the long term.
That's fantastic. And that's part of what was very clear in what you wrote, Tomas. Your job is to look at growth, though, right? So you've looked at the growth of the contagion. You've actually come up with excellent suggestions of what government should be doing. I think the last question I have is more, this is global. It's the first time we've seen a pandemic like this. You understand business, you understand growth of business and the kind of breaks that this is going to do globally. What do you see happening with trade, with the economies?
So this is a fascinating question. I think there's a short term and then there's a medium term. On the short term, everything is going to suffer a lot. There was an interesting piece by Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, I think, who explained the different pandemics of the 20th century and showed what the impacts were in the market. And one of the big takeaways there is pandemics like this are just a dip. So if you have the economy, the market's going like this, it does like this, a little bit down, and then back up. And it's, if you eliminate this little hole, it's as if it had never existed. It is likely that something like that is going to happen from the market's perspective. It's definitely what I hope. But if you think about it, it's very likely that in a few months, we might have a treatment. It may be weeks. After that, there's going to be a vaccine, and things will be able to go back to pretty normal, depending on how much this thing mutates. But I think the more interesting question actually is what's going to happen in the long term. And I think this shows the emergence of two trends at the same time. Number one is the value of decentralization and free speech, right? The reason why this wasn't caught earlier in China is because of the centralization and the lack of free speech. If you enable everybody to be able to raise the voice and you listen to the voices, that is a very strong way to prevent this kind of thing. And so that's kind of at the lowest level, empowering the individual. I think it is a trend that this is going to push towards. And then I think at the exact opposite of the chain, at the supranational level, you have a situation where the World Health Organization was on top of all of these things. They understood exactly what was happening. They understood exactly what you need to do, and they had zero power. And so we get into a world where now the actions of one country are going to be impacting what happens in another country. That requires a very strong debate of what are the right levels of authority for different needs. And so, for example, I can imagine a world where the World Health Organization was given more powers than it has had in the past, because it could have a substantially better reaction than any government standalone.
That's interesting, yeah, and where we're headed. I think just as a corollary to something you said earlier, the free speech versus centralized speech. Draconian measures work the best, right, in this time and age, and it's ironically it's the West that hasn't been used to taking these kinds of things, where the spread has taken off exponentially. What kind of impact do you think this will have on democracies?
Yeah, Japan is a democracy. Taiwan is a democracy. True. Hong Kong is fighting hard to be a democracy. Yes. So I think to me, it's more a matter of training than it is of democracy. I think if the Western countries had been more experienced, they would have had a better reaction. I think it's also a sign of the political class. I think many times they want to react to what people think rather than show leadership. And to me, this is a perfect example of a moment when you can show leadership. When I hear, for example, something like the UK government said around, oh, we're not sure people are going to keep this behavior of being locked down for months, so we don't want to order it right now. It is your responsibility to make that happen. Show some leadership. And so I definitely don't see it at all as a failure of democracy. Of course, an authoritarian regime can coordinate things substantially faster, but democratic governments also have the mechanisms to do it. For example, now with national emergency, there's plenty of powers that you can have to do whatever you want very, very fast. I was in a conversation with a group earlier today that was saying, hey, can I sue the American government because they closed my church? And the answer is absolutely not. Not only that, but if you're outside and there's a curfew, they can take you and they can lock you, and there's nothing you can do. And so the democracies have the powers to do it. I think what we're lacking is just the experience, and in some cases, the leadership.
Okay, and I know I said last question. This really is my last question. This is a new time. You said this earlier, new powers for WHO, but on everything, we've never lived through anything like this. Just the same way that, tech brought along a situation where we've never lived through anything like that. Social cohesion, trust, there's so many different factors to include into this. I guess if you were to pull out one lesson, one factor that countries all around the world, societies need to keep in mind, what would that be?
It's a very interesting question. I think just taking a step back on the retrospective here, lost my train of thought. I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Just that this is this very, we've never been in a place like this before. And you talked about the WHO perhaps being given more powers. If you were to pull out a kind of guiding principle as we navigate this landscape, what would that be?
Got it. Yeah, I think the key is that people don't incorporate information easily. So our brains are structured in a way that we learn from the world, especially when you're younger. You understand how it works. And the older you get, the more everything is stable and you don't revisit it. Comes something like this, and there's many things that you need to revisit, but you're anchored in your previous way of thinking. And so the human brain is not well structured to incorporate this new information. And so that is, to me, why people have underreacted completely. They just couldn't grasp how big the change was going to be. This change is probably going to, so this epidemic going to create several changes culturally. Some of these, which you have already seen in countries that were touched by SARS. For example, I'm going to guess that it will be completely unacceptable to cough in public without a mask, right?
Yes.
Not acceptable to go to work coughing, right? Whereas in the past, in some of the countries where I worked, if you just had a cough and went home, it's like, what? Are you lazy? Completely, radically different in the future, right? People who maybe a handshake is done. Definitely people are going to wash their hands more. And so there's some of these changes that are going to, I think, stay with us over the next generations. But I think, to me, the more interesting concept is that one of incorporating new information. The more globalized the world is, the more connected it is, the faster it goes, the faster it progresses, the faster these changes are going to be coming. And we will need to adapt our way of being to be able to incorporate this new information as fast as we can to change our models of how the world works as fast as we can.
Fantastic. Tomas, thank you so much. Thank you.